Hello and welcome to Week 8 of Biology 125, Plant Biology here at NICC's online class. This week we're going to be reading out of Chapter 30 of Biology 2E, so back to the other textbook. Again, Chapter 30 in Biology 2E. Specifically, we're going to be looking at only looking at 30.6, so the sixth section of Chapter 30, and that's really looking at growth hormones, tropisms, regulations, so how plants are responding to their environments is really what we're going to be talking about today. And although it's only one section in that textbook, there's a fair bit of information in there. So that should keep us covered for this week. So chapter 30.6 is really about how plants are interacting with their worlds, sensing their world around them, and then responding to whatever input they're getting from their environments. One of the primary parts of their environments that plants are sensing is light. Light is, the source of energy that drives photosynthesis, so plants really are very strongly impacted by the amount of light in their environments, the direction of light, and lots of different facets of light. They use light to grow, they use light to tell time, or track time anyways, and again they move towards or sometimes away from light. Major molecules that are used in the sensing of light with plants are called phytochromes. These are basically colorful proteins that react to light. Seeds use phytochromes to determine if there's enough light to germinate. Plants use phytochromes to determine what season it is. Here in Iowa, in the middle of October, our leaves are changing. The leaves are changing from the summer green to orange, yellows, browns as photosynthesis starts to shut down, preparing these plants for winter. Phototropism is the movement of plants or plant parts towards or away from light. You can have positive phototropism where plants are growing towards a light source, or negative phototropism where plants are growing away from a light source. And the roots and shoots of plants exhibit different sorts of tropisms depending on the light. Plants can also sense gravity. You guys are probably familiar with that when you see a plant that maybe got tipped sideways, and so it has a sort of sideways bend to it, but then it straightens up and starts growing straight, right? That plant is responding to its environment. It's responding to gravity, and that response is called gravitropism, or a gravitropic response. And again, you can have positive or negative gravitropic responses, and these responses are due to the settling of what are called amyloplasts, which are specialized starch granules that settle to the bottom of cells and induce a chemical signal to be sent that stimulates or not growth in these cells. Many other sorts of growth responses in plants rely on hormones. Plants don't have neurons like animals do, so they can't send and receive signals in the rapid ways that animals can, but they definitely communicate between themselves, or within themselves rather, and between each other as well. So plants send information back and forth within the plant itself and to its neighbors via these chemical signals called hormones. In plants there are 5 primary classes of hormones: auxins, cytokinins, gibberellins, ethylene, and abscisic acid. When you're reading through the text, take some time and understand the different roles that these different hormone classes have in plants, because they're fairly specialized in what sorts of signals they're sending within the plant. Plants also respond to touch, physical contact. Sometimes that physical contact is from the wind. The sort of classic sort of touch response is called a thigmotropic response. So thigmotropism is seen very commonly in plant parts like tendrils. So if you think about a grapevine or a pumpkin vine or an ivy vine or something like that, where you have tendrils climbing up a wall, you'll have the tendril wrapping around a structure. That's a thigmotropic response. So plants responding to that touch and growing in response to that stimulus. There's also what are called thigmonastic responses, and that would be like a Venus flytrap closing on an insect in response to the hairs inside the leaves. Those specialized leaves of the Venus flytrap have hairs. If those hairs become stimulated, they close. That's called a thigmonastic response. And you can also have what's called thigmomorphogenesis. So morphogenesis being growth and development, and thigmo being in response to touch. So if you think about a tree outside, that tree is constantly being pushed on by wind. That wind constantly over time produces a physical change in the plant. If it's a tree, the trunk will grow stronger, grow more stout. The leaves or the branches will branch off in different patterns. Here in Iowa, we have a tree called the bur oak, and the sort of classic look of a bur oak is this open-grown sort of prairie-style bur oak, where you have this sort of short, broad trunk and a big bushy top on it, and that response is a response, this thigmomorphogenic response to this constantly being buffeted by winds, and it produces that sort of growth response in trees. If you put those trees in a sheltered area, so if other trees grow around it, the side branches of those trees will drop off on occasion. Plants also respond to predation. So if you're an herbivore, if you're an organism that eats plants, plants are your source of nutrition, and plants don't want to be eaten in the same way that you and I don't want to be eaten, probably. And plants have defenses against that. They also have defenses against pathogens, so disease-causing organisms. The first barrier that plants have in this sort of protection scheme is their outer coverings. If you think about a tree again, they have a big, tough bark covering, right? That bark provides a pretty high level of protection against predation. Also, you have, say, a waxy cuticle on the leaves that might be that will provide at least a thin layer of predation. And if you're a tiny insect, that waxy cuticle may be the equivalent of a 3-inch bark on an oak tree or something like that. So plants have a number of these sort of physical barriers that they have to prevent predation by herbivores. Also, adaptations like thorns and spines are also good at preventing predation by herbivores. Those are sort of some of the physical traits that plants have to prevent herbivory, but they also have chemical responses to herbivory, and usually that's through the production of what are called secondary metabolites. So these are chemicals that aren't really used for growth and development, but they're really there as sort of a defensive mechanism against organisms that would otherwise eat them. These are often toxic, irritating, other sorts of chemicals that elicit a negative response from these plants. If you think about plants like mints or sages or oils, that smell, or catnip, for example, is a type of mint that has a very strong smell. Those volatile chemicals are often very off-putting to people or other animals. Cats happen to love catnip for the most part, but if you're a different kind of organism, you might have that very strong smell and say, no thanks, I'm not going to eat that. Some plants produce stimulants. Coffee comes from a plant, comes from a shrub that produces a coffee bean. Well, the target chemical that most people are consuming from coffee is caffeine, and that's a chemical stimulant in that plant to prevent herbivory. If you're a smoker or a tobacco user, that nicotine, again, is this chemical stimulant that's meant to sort of push that herbivory predation off of the plant and move it to a different plant. Some plants produce a bitter taste. If you are familiar with tonic water, it has a bitter taste, and that taste comes from quinine plant. Some plants produce chemicals that produce a lethargic response on the part of herbivores. Opiates are a great example. Poppy is the sort of natural source of opiates that are pretty common in the world today. That opiate response is a chemical defense by the plant to prevent organisms from eating. And some plants produce what are just basically outright toxic, deadly sorts of chemicals. Cassava is a good example. It's a root that's consumed by millions of people globally. If you fail to prepare it correctly, you will suffer the effects of cyanide poisoning and die. If it's prepared correctly, it's perfectly safe and a nutritious food source, but cassava can be deadly if not prepared properly. So plants have these mechanisms to either prevent herbivory through, say, spines or thick bark, or to actively sort of defend against herbivory with these sort of chemical means. Plants are also able to defend themselves against pathogens, so organisms that would make them sick, think bacteria or fungi, things like that. In some cases, the damaged tissue of these plants will simply sort of die and wall off from the rest of the organism, and the plant carries on its life with a little scar on it. Sometimes damaged tissue in plants will release a chemical that may, say, attract a wasp that will then, say, attack I think I said that wrong. The chemical released may attract a wasp that will then attack, say, the caterpillar that's predating the plant. So there are many complex pathways that plants respond to herbivory and damage, and really into the rest of their environment. So they respond to light, phototropic responses. They respond to gravity, gravitropic responses. They respond to touch or other sorts of physical stimulus through these thigmotropic responses. And they also have these defense responses that are really, the integration of all these things really drives how plants grow and develop, and the main chemical signals that are being sent with these different sorts of stimuli are those signals are being sent with hormones, so these chemical signals. So the responses are not nearly as fast as an animal can give with, say, a nervous system response, but given enough time, and some of these responses are quite rapid, but for the most part, plants move at a slower pace than do animals, and so they have these hormonal responses that are really driving their growth and development. All right, so again, this is chapter 30.6 in Biology 2E, and this should keep you pretty busy for this week. Hope you have a great week, and see you next week. Bye.